The moment the judge signed our divorce decree, my ex-wife Rebecca didn't even wait until we were out of the courthouse parking lot. I watched her, through the tinted glass of my truck, already on her phone, laughing. Her whole face lit up in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in over 2 years. My oldest son, Noah, 16 years old, sat in the passenger seat beside me, quiet, watching his phone, with a strange expression on his face. "Dad," he said, "the family group chat. Mom just sent something. I don't think it was supposed to go to us." He turned the screen toward me at a red light. A photo. Rebecca, her sister, her mother, and a man named Adrian Cole, standing at a private table at the most expensive restaurant in the city. 4 champagne flutes raised. The caption reading, "Finally free. Round 1 is on me." I did not say a word. I just handed Noah his phone back, reached over, and turned the radio up slightly, and kept driving. Because my sons needed to see their father calm, not their father breaking. What none of them knew, not Rebecca, not her family, not the man in that photograph, was that an envelope that had arrived in my mailbox 8 months earlier had already guaranteed their celebration would not last past dessert. If you've ever had to hold yourself together for your children while your whole world was quietly falling apart, hit the like button right now. It genuinely means something to this old dad. Subscribe to Humble Dad Stories so you never miss one of our stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from today and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment, and it means more than you know to hear from you. My name is Daniel Foster. I am 59 years old, and for 26 years I have run a commercial refrigeration company out of a mid-sized city in the Midwest. The kind of business most people never think about until their walk-in freezer breaks down in the middle of July and their entire inventory is at risk. I service restaurants, grocery chains, hospitals, anyone who needs cold to stay cold, reliably, every single day, without fail. It is not a glamorous business. Nobody has ever asked me for an autograph because I fixed their compressor. But it is honest, steady work, and over 26 years it built a comfortable, secure life for my family. The kind of life I never had growing up as the son of a long-haul truck driver who was gone 3 weeks out of every month. I should tell you a little more about how Foster Commercial Refrigeration actually started, because it matters to everything that came later, especially to what happened with Robert Callahan's trust. I grew up in a small house outside a manufacturing town that had already started dying by the time I was in high school, the son of a long-haul truck driver named Walt Foster, who was gone 3 weeks out of every month hauling freight across 6 states just to keep our family afloat. My mother worked the counter at a hardware store for 11 years, and between the two of them, there was never much left over for anything beyond the essentials. I learned to fix things out of pure necessity. Our old refrigerator, our leaking water heater, the ancient window unit that kept our house barely livable through the worst of the summer heat. By the time I graduated high school, I already knew more about compressors and refrigerant lines than most licensed technicians twice my age. All of it learned from library books, and a lot of trial and error in our own garage. I met Rebecca when I was 31 years old, 3 years into running my own small refrigeration service company. Tired, lonely, and honestly a little afraid I'd spend the rest of my life married only to the business. She was 26 then, working as an administrative assistant at a commercial property management firm I did service work for, and I still remember the first time she brought me a cup of coffee unprompted while I was elbow deep in a walk-in cooler compressor at one of her company's properties, just because she'd noticed I'd been there since 6 that morning without a break. That small, unremarkable kindness is still, honestly, one of my clearest memories from those early years, and it's part of why everything that happened later hurt as deeply as it did. The woman I fell in love with really was capable of that kind of genuine, uncomplicated warmth. Somewhere over 22 years, and especially over the final 3, that warmth got redirected somewhere else entirely. Rebecca and I were married for 22 years. We met when I was 31, already 3 years into running my own company, tired of the loneliness of building something entirely by myself. She was warm back then, genuinely warm. The kind of woman who remembered the names of my employees' children and sent handwritten thank you cards to vendors who'd helped us out during a difficult stretch. We had our first son, Noah, 2 years into the marriage. Our second son, Ethan, followed 4 years after that. For a long stretch of our marriage, I believed, honestly and completely, that we had built something solid, something that would hold. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story where I claim I was a perfect husband for 22 years. I worked long hours. I missed birthdays some years during our busiest commercial contract seasons. I know now, looking back with the clarity that only distance provides, that Rebecca spent a lot of years feeling like she came second to a refrigeration business. And I understand, even now, why that eventually wore something down inside her. But understanding why a wound happened does not make the wound acceptable. And it certainly does not excuse what came after. The cracks in our marriage became impossible to ignore about 3 years before the divorce was finalized. Rebecca started a part-time consulting position with a local commercial real estate firm, something she'd wanted to do for years once Ethan was old enough that she felt she had more time for herself. I supported it completely. I was proud of her. Honestly proud. Watching her build something of her own after 2 decades of prioritizing our family. It was through that job that she met Adrian Cole. Adrian Cole presented himself, to everyone who met him, as a wildly successful independent real estate developer. The kind of man who talked casually about 7-figure deals over dinner, and always seemed to have a new luxury car in his driveway every 18 months. He was smooth in a way that, looking back now, should have set off alarm bells for anyone paying close attention. He complimented easily. He remembered small details about people's lives, and repeated them back at exactly the right moment to make you feel important. Rebecca started mentioning him more and more over the following year. Always carefully, always with the same explanation. He's just a business contact, Daniel. We work on deals together sometimes. Don't be paranoid. I believed her, for longer than I probably should have, because believing the person you've built a life with is a lot easier than confronting the alternative. The envelope that changed everything arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, 8 months before that courthouse parking lot, 8 months before the champagne, 8 months before any of this became a story I would ever need to tell anyone. It was a routine piece of mail, addressed to Rebecca, from a financial institution I didn't recognize, a statement for an account I had never heard of in my entire 22 years of marriage. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest with you about that. Some part of me, even then, some quiet, cowardly part of me, wanted to simply set it on the counter for her and pretend I'd never seen the return address. But another part of me, the part that had spent 26 years reading balance sheets and knowing exactly where every dollar in my company went, could not let it go. I opened it. Inside was a statement for an investment account in Rebecca's name alone. One I had never seen, never signed for, never been told existed, showing a balance that had fluctuated significantly over the previous 18 months, currently sitting just under $200,000. $200,000, moving in and out of an account my own wife had never once mentioned in 22 years of what I believed was a shared, honest financial life. I did not confront her that night. I want you to understand why, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I have built an entire career, an entire business, around one simple principle. You do not fix a problem by reacting to it emotionally in the moment you discover it. You diagnose it first. You understand exactly what's broken before you ever pick up a tool. So instead of confronting Rebecca with anger and accusations that night, I quietly, carefully, began doing what I do best. I started paying attention. Over the following 6 weeks, I noticed things I had somehow trained myself not to notice for years. Late-night phone calls Rebecca took in the garage, out of earshot, always ending abruptly when I walked past. A new habit of clearing her browser history every single evening, something she'd never done in 20 years of marriage. Weekend conference trips for her consulting work that never seemed to have any actual conference attached to them when I looked discreetly at the hotel loyalty program statements that occasionally still arrived at our house by mistake. I am not a man who enjoys detective work. I would have much rather been wrong about all of it. But 26 years of running a business had taught me that the numbers rarely lie, even when the people attached to them do. I finally reached out to a retired forensic accountant named Walter Grimes, a man I'd known professionally for almost 15 years through a mutual client in the restaurant supply business. A man with a reputation for quiet, extremely thorough work, and an even more valuable reputation for absolute discretion. I sat across from Walter at his kitchen table on a rainy Saturday afternoon, laid out everything I had, the statement, my notes, my growing suspicion, and asked him a single question. I need to know exactly what's happening with our money, Walter. Whatever it is, I need the truth, not a guess. It took Walter almost 5 weeks of careful, methodical tracing, working with financial records I quietly gathered for him. Some legally accessible as a joint account holder on our primary finances. Some he obtained through entirely legal public and semi-public channels. I won't bore you with the details of, but all of it, eventually, painting a picture that was far more complicated, and honestly far sadder than I had originally assumed. Walter called me into his office on a Thursday evening and spread a series of printouts across his desk, tracing lines between account numbers with a red pen, the way I imagine a detective might connect photographs on a corkboard. "Daniel," he said, "your wife has been transferring money, consistently, over the last 18 months, into accounts connected to Adrian Cole's real estate ventures. Roughly $240,000 total, across several transfers. But here's what you need to understand before you jump to the conclusion I can see you're already jumping to." He tapped the paper firmly. "This isn't a simple affair with money attached. Adrian Cole is, from everything I can trace here, functionally insolvent. His development companies are carrying enormous, unsustainable debt. Multiple projects have stalled or collapsed entirely over the past 3 years. And this pattern," he said, pulling out 3 more printouts, each showing a different woman's name. "This is not the first time he's done this." Walter had been a forensic accountant for federal investigators for nearly 2 decades before retiring into private consulting work, and he had a particular, quiet fascination with what he called pattern men, individuals whose entire lifestyle was built not on actual wealth, but on the careful, repeated cultivation of other people's trust and other people's money. "I've seen probably a dozen men exactly like this over my career, Daniel," he told me that Thursday evening in his office, tapping the 3 additional printouts he'd laid across his desk. "They're rarely sloppy. They're patient. They pick their targets carefully, usually women who are financially independent enough to have real money to access, but emotionally vulnerable enough, at whatever point they meet them, to want desperately to believe in the story being told to them." The first of the 3 other women Walter had identified was a divorced dental practice owner in her early 50s who had reportedly invested nearly $90,000 into one of Adrian's earlier projects, almost 6 years earlier. Money Walter's research suggested had never been repaid. The second was a widow who had inherited a modest but comfortable sum from her late husband's life insurance policy and had apparently funneled almost half of it into Adrian's ventures over an 18-month relationship that had ended, according to a single public court filing Walter had located. In a small claims lawsuit she eventually dropped rather than pursue further. The third was harder for Walter to trace fully, a name that appeared only briefly in older banking records before disappearing from any further documentation Walter could access. "I don't know what happened to her," Walter admitted. "But the pattern is the pattern, Daniel. This is not a man who fell in love with your wife. This is a man executing a strategy he has clearly used, successfully, more than once before." I sat very still in that office chair, processing what Walter was telling me. Adrian Cole was not simply a wealthy man Rebecca had fallen for. He was, as far as Walter's careful research could determine, a man who had spent the better part of a decade quietly convincing financially independent women with their own money, their own careers, their own trust in him, to fund his collapsing real estate empire, one relationship at a time, always presenting himself as the successful developer, never once telling any of them the truth about how close to total collapse his actual finances were. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly, because I think it's important to this story, and important to how I ultimately chose to handle everything that followed. My first instinct, sitting in Walter's office that evening, was pure anger, directed entirely at Rebecca. I assumed, in that first raw moment, that she had knowingly, deliberately funneled our family's money to fund an affair, betraying me with full and complete knowledge of what she was doing. It took me several more weeks, and several more conversations with Walter, and honestly, a great deal of quiet, private reflection, to understand a more complicated truth. Rebecca was not the architect of this. She was, in every way that mattered, another one of Adrian Cole's targets, a woman who had been carefully, patiently, expertly manipulated by a man who specialized in exactly that particular con. Walter found records of promises Adrian had made to Rebecca in writing, texts he'd somehow obtained through channels I chose not to ask too many questions about. Promises of a shared future once his current project difficulties resolved. Promises that the money she was quietly moving into his ventures wasn't a gift, but an investment that would return triple its value within 18 months. He had shown her fabricated project renderings for developments that, according to Walter's research, had never actually broken ground. He had told her, our marriage was already emotionally over, that I no longer truly saw her, long before she ever believed it herself, softening her, patiently, methodically, the exact same way I imagine he had softened at least 3 other women before her. None of that excused what she did. I want to be completely clear about that, because I know some of you watching might be tempted to think I'm building toward a story where I simply forgive everything and it's all somehow fine. It is not fine. A wife who quietly moves nearly $250,000 of shared family wealth into a stranger's failing business ventures, without ever once telling her husband, has broken something in a marriage that cannot simply be talked back into place, regardless of how she was manipulated into doing it. But understanding the full truth changed how I chose to move forward, and it changed, completely, who I ultimately decided deserved the full weight of what was coming. Looking back now, with everything Walter eventually uncovered laid out in front of me, I can trace the exact shape of how Adrian worked his way into Rebecca's life over those 3 years, and I think it's worth walking through. Not to relitigate old pain, but because I suspect some of you watching this might recognize the same careful, patient pattern in your own lives, or in the life of someone you love. It started small, according to what Rebecca eventually admitted in pieces during that kitchen table conversation 2 months after the divorce. A coffee meeting to discuss a property listing that ran unusually long. A compliment about a presentation she'd given at work, delivered with a specificity that made her feel genuinely seen, in a way she said she hadn't felt at home in years. A late-night text framed carefully as strictly professional, checking in on a deal that had fallen through, that gradually, over many months, became a late-night text checking in on her, specifically, about nothing business-related at all. Adrian never once, according to Rebecca, directly asked her for money in the beginning. That came much later, after nearly 18 months of careful emotional groundwork, framed always as an opportunity rather than a request. An exclusive early investment window in a project he described as almost guaranteed to triple in value, an opportunity he claimed he was only sharing with her because he trusted her judgment more than his own actual business partners. By the time actual money changed hands, Rebecca already believed, completely, that she understood Adrian better than his own investors did, that she was helping a genuinely brilliant man weather a temporary rough patch that the rest of the market simply hadn't caught up to yet. I don't say any of this to excuse what she ultimately did with our family's money. I say it because understanding exactly how thoroughly and patiently she was worked on changed, permanently, how much anger I was ultimately able to direct at her specifically, versus at the man who had spent years perfecting exactly this particular con. I filed for divorce 4 months after that evening in Walter's office. I did it calmly, quietly, through my attorney. A sharp, patient man named Martin Hayes who had handled legal matters for my business for almost 20 years, and whom I trusted implicitly. I did not confront Rebecca with everything Walter had found. I did not show her the printouts, the transfer records, the fabricated project renderings Adrian had used on her. I simply told her, honestly, that our marriage had reached a point I could no longer continue in, and I let her believe, for the entire duration of the divorce proceedings, that my decision was based on nothing more than the distance and disconnection that had been growing between us for years. She did not know that I knew about Adrian. She did not know about Walter. She did not know about the $240,000. I want to explain why I chose that particular kind of silence, because it was, without question, the hardest part of this entire ordeal. Martin Hayes advised me in very clear terms, early in the process, that revealing what I knew during divorce proceedings could actually work against me and against my sons in several complicated ways, potentially dragging out custody arrangements, opening up a messy public fight that would put Noah and Ethan directly in the crossfire of accusations and counter-accusations neither of them deserved to carry. Daniel, Martin told me, sitting across from me in his office one afternoon, the strongest position you can take right now is patience. Let the divorce proceed cleanly. Protect your boys from the ugliest version of this story. There will be time, later, for the rest of the truth to come out on its own terms. And when it does, you'll be standing on much firmer ground than you would be if you go to war over it right now. I trusted Martin completely, the same way I'd trusted Walter. And so for 4 difficult months, I sat across mediation tables from Rebecca and her attorney. Quiet, composed, never once revealing what I knew. Focused entirely on securing a fair, stable custody arrangement for Noah and Ethan, and an equitable division of the assets Rebecca hadn't already quietly diverted elsewhere. It was, without question, the hardest kind of patience I have ever practiced in my entire life. Sitting in a room with the woman I'd built 22 years alongside, knowing exactly what she'd done, and exactly who had done it to her, and saying absolutely nothing about any of it. Those 4 months of mediation were, without exaggeration, the hardest sustained stretch of self-control I have ever exercised in 59 years of life. I remember one session in particular, about 6 weeks in, when Rebecca's attorney suggested, delicately, that Rebecca had sacrificed career opportunities throughout our marriage to support my business and our household, and was therefore entitled to a more generous spousal support arrangement going forward. I sat there, knowing exactly where nearly $250,000 of our shared money had actually gone over the previous 18 months, knowing exactly who Adrian Cole really was, and exactly how insolvent his ventures actually were. And I said absolutely nothing beyond what Martin had carefully prepared me to say about our actual joint finances, as I understood them to be documented. I remember gripping the edge of the conference table hard enough under the surface that my knuckles went white, while my face, I hoped, stayed perfectly calm. Martin caught me in the hallway after that particular session, reading something in my expression I hadn't managed to fully hide. "You're doing exactly the right thing, Daniel," he told me quietly. "I know how hard this is. But trust me when I tell you that the version of this story where you stayed patient and let the truth arrive on its own timeline is going to be a far better story for you and for those boys than the version where you blew everything up in a mediation room today." I trusted him, and I held on, session after session, week after week, watching Rebecca describe a version of our marriage's ending that left out an entire chapter she apparently still believed I knew nothing about. It was during those same 4 months, almost as if fate itself understood exactly what kind of quiet reckoning was already building, that I received a phone call that changed the entire shape of everything that would happen next. The call came from a man named Preston Marsh, an attorney I had never spoken with before, representing something called the Callahan Family Legacy Trust. It took me a moment to place the name, and then it hit me all at once. Robert Callahan had been my very first business partner, 28 years earlier, when I was still a 28-year-old refrigeration technician, trying to scrape together enough capital to start my own service company, instead of working for someone else's for the rest of my life. Robert had put up the initial capital that got Foster Commercial Refrigeration off the ground, back when it was still called Callahan Foster Cold Solutions, back when neither of us had 2 nickels to rub together outside of what we'd invested in that first delivery van. Robert had passed away suddenly, from a heart attack, almost 15 years earlier, at only 51 years old, long before either of us had any idea how large the company we'd started together would eventually become. Robert had no children of his own, and in the years after his death, I had lost touch almost entirely with his side of the family, aside from a modest condolence card I'd sent his sister the year he passed. What I did not know, what nobody in my life knew, was that Robert Callahan had quietly established a private family investment trust in the final years before his death, seeding it with his original ownership stake in our company, along with a series of careful, patient long-term investments he'd made privately over the years, structured deliberately so that it would only fully mature and become distributable 15 years after his passing, managed in the meantime by a small, discreet group of trustees bound by strict confidentiality until that maturation date arrived. "Mr. Foster," Preston Marsh told me over the phone, his voice careful and measured, "I need to inform you that as Robert Callahan's original business partner and the trust's designated secondary beneficiary contingency, you are entitled to a substantial distribution from the Callahan Family Legacy Trust, which reaches full maturity in approximately 5 months. Given the size of the distribution, I strongly recommend we schedule an in-person meeting to walk through the details properly. Robert Callahan had been a strange, wonderful kind of business partner, the sort of man who believed in people faster and more completely than almost anyone else I've ever known. I met him at a diner counter when I was 28 years old, freshly laid off from a refrigeration company that had gone under, sketching out rough numbers for what it might cost to start my own small service operation on a paper napkin because I couldn't afford actual notebook paper that particular week. Robert, sitting 2 stools down, 12 years older than me and already modestly successful in commercial real estate, leaned over, looked at my napkin math for a long moment, and said, "Your numbers are wrong, but your instincts are right. I'll put up the first 20,000 if you're willing to work harder than anyone else in this city for the next 5 years." I thought he was joking. He was not joking. 3 weeks later, Callahan Foster Cold Solutions had its first delivery van, a rusted-out 1998 cargo van we bought for $1,800, and Robert personally helped me repaint over a single long weekend. Robert stayed on as a silent, supportive partner for nearly 6 years, before an opportunity in Arizona pulled him toward a different chapter of his career, and I bought out his ownership stake, fairly, the same way I would later buy back Preston's confidence in me, over and over throughout the following decades. We stayed close for years afterward, phone calls every few months, an annual fishing trip we managed to keep up for almost a decade, before life and distance made it harder. When Robert passed away suddenly from a heart attack at 51, I flew out for the funeral and gave a short, unpolished eulogy about a man who'd bet on a broke 28-year-old with nothing but a napkin full of bad math and good instincts. I had no idea, standing at that podium 15 years earlier, that Robert had already, quietly, begun building something specifically designed to find its way back to me at exactly the moment I would eventually need it most. I sat in my truck outside a job site that afternoon, absolutely stunned, listening to a man I'd never met explain that my late business partner, a man who had believed in me before anyone else in my life ever had spent the final years of his life quietly building something enormous, something specifically designed to eventually land back in my hands, at exactly the moment, though of course neither Robert nor Preston could have possibly known this in advance, when I would need it most. Preston Marsh's office turned out to be a modest, unassuming suite above a bakery downtown. Nothing like the glass-walled high-rise firms I'd half expected, given the scale of what he was about to tell me. Preston himself was younger than I anticipated, maybe 45, with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had clearly spent his entire career handling exactly this kind of delicate, high-stakes confidentiality work. He walked me through the trust documents page by page over nearly 2 hours, showing me Robert's original handwritten letter of intent, drafted the year before his death, explaining in Robert's own unmistakable voice exactly why he'd structured things the way he had. "Daniel doesn't need help when things are easy," Robert had written, according to the copy Preston showed me that day. "He needs a foundation waiting for him whenever things eventually get hard, because a man like that will spend so much of his life giving everything away to everyone else that he'll forget to save anything for the day he actually needs it himself. 15 years should be enough time for that day to come, one way or another." I sat in that small office above a bakery, an envelope of Robert's handwriting in my own hands 15 years after his funeral, and I understood, with a clarity that still moves me every time I think about it, that my old partner had somehow known, decades in advance, exactly the kind of quiet crisis I would eventually need rescuing from, even though neither of us could have possibly predicted the specific shape it would ultimately take. The distribution, Preston explained over the following weeks, once all the trust's investments were properly finalized and valued, totaled just over $4.6 million, built from Robert's original stake in our company, patiently reinvested, and compounded over 15 years by a trustee firm Robert had personally selected specifically for their conservative, long-horizon investment philosophy. I made a decision, sitting in Preston Marsh's office the week I fully understood the scale of what was coming, a decision I have not regretted for a single day since. I told Preston I did not want the trust's existence disclosed to anyone, under any circumstances, until my divorce was fully and legally finalized. I explained, briefly, without going into every detail, that I did not want a life-changing sum of money to become a factor, in any direction, in the ongoing division of marital assets, or in any potential custody negotiations. Preston, a careful and ethical man in his own right, agreed completely, noting that under the trust's own confidentiality provisions, He was under no legal obligation to disclose its existence to anyone outside the designated beneficiary until I personally authorized it. So I said nothing. Not to Martin Hayes. Not fully, though I did eventually inform him in general terms once the divorce was nearly finalized, purely so he could advise me on the correct legal timing. Not to Rebecca. Not to her attorney. Not to Noah or Ethan, though that particular silence weighed on me more than any of the others, because I hate keeping secrets from my own sons. I simply continued moving through the final months of the divorce, exactly as I had the 4 before it. Calm, composed, patient, letting Rebecca and Adrian and everyone around them believe that I was simply a quiet, somewhat defeated man, losing half of a modest, comfortable life he'd spent 26 years building. Part of what made those 4 months of mediation bearable was watching how clearly Noah and Ethan expressed what they actually wanted, once the court-appointed custody evaluator, a calm, experienced woman named Dr. Patricia Nolan, met with each of them privately over the course of several sessions. Dr. Nolan later explained to Martin, in the careful clinical language evaluators use, that both boys had described a home life with me that felt stable and predictable, even during the years I'd been working the longest hours, while describing an increasingly unpredictable pattern of canceled plans and distracted attention from Rebecca over the previous 2 years, though neither boy, thankfully, seemed to have any concrete awareness of Adrian Cole's actual involvement in that shifting pattern. Ethan, only 12 at the time, apparently told Dr. Nolan simply that he always knew where Dad would be, which struck me, when Martin relayed it to me afterward, as one of the plainest and most devastating compliments I have ever received in my entire life, precisely because it was so unintentional. The divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday morning in a courthouse downtown, the same courthouse where I'd once, decades earlier, filed the original paperwork to incorporate my business. The proceedings themselves were almost anticlimactic after 4 months of careful negotiation, a judge reading through an already agreed settlement in a flat, procedural voice, granting me primary physical custody of both Noah and Ethan, which both boys, now 16 and 12, had clearly expressed a preference for during their private conversations with the court-appointed evaluator, and dividing our remaining marital assets in a way that, while not perfectly even, was fair enough that I signed it without complaint. Rebecca did not look at me once during the entire proceeding. She sat beside her attorney, dressed carefully, her posture straight, and the moment the judge finished speaking, I watched her exhale in a way that looked less like grief and more like relief. I understood, watching her in that moment, that she genuinely believed, with her whole heart, that she was walking out of that courthouse toward the beginning of a happier, freer life with a man who loved her. I gathered Noah and Ethan from the small waiting area outside the courtroom, and the 3 of us walked out together into a gray, overcast morning toward my truck. That was when Noah showed me the photograph in the truck, the champagne, the caption, "Finally free. Round 1 is on me." I did not react the way part of me wanted to react. I did not turn the truck around. I did not call Martin Hayes immediately demanding to know if there was anything at all, I could still do to make Rebecca and Adrian's celebration feel less triumphant. I simply drove my sons toward home, stopping, about 40 minutes later, at a gas station off the interstate, because Ethan needed to use the restroom, and I needed, honestly, a few minutes alone to gather myself before we got home. Ethan went inside to use the restroom and grab a bag of chips, and Noah stayed in the truck with me, still holding his phone but no longer looking at it, staring instead out the windshield at the gray afternoon sky. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you okay?" I told him honestly that today had been a hard day, but that hard days eventually end, and that what mattered most to me, right then, was that he and Ethan were okay. Noah was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I have thought about often in the years since. "Mom looked really happy in that picture," he said. "I don't know if I'm supposed to be glad about that or not." I told him he was allowed to feel whatever he actually felt about it, that there wasn't a right or wrong answer, and that loving both of his parents, even when they weren't together anymore, wasn't something he ever needed my permission for. He nodded slowly, and then he asked, in the careful, testing way 16-year-olds sometimes ask the questions that actually matter most to them, "Do you think you'll ever be that happy again, Dad?" I told him I honestly didn't know yet, but that I intended to find out, one steady day at a time, and that he shouldn't worry about carrying that particular question for me. It was in that quiet, ordinary moment, sitting in a gas station parking lot with my 16-year-old son, that my phone finally rang. Martin Hayes. "Daniel," he said, his voice carrying a note I hadn't heard from him before, something close to genuine excitement wrapped carefully in his usual professional composure. "I just got off the phone with Rebecca's attorney. I think you'll want to hear how that conversation ended." Preston Marsh, as instructed, had waited until the exact moment the divorce decree was officially entered into the county record, a matter of hours after the courthouse proceedings concluded, before he made the call I had authorized him to make weeks in advance. He contacted Rebecca's attorney directly, formally, informing him that Rebecca Foster, née Callahan Whitmore before our marriage, held a distributable secondary beneficiary interest in the Callahan Family Legacy Trust, by virtue of having been legally married to me at the time the trust's original beneficiary designation was structured, an interest that, under the specific terms Robert Callahan had written into the trust 15 years earlier, Rebecca now had the legal standing to either claim a formal share of through renewed post-divorce litigation, or voluntarily and permanently waive. I had instructed Preston, weeks earlier, to present her with both options clearly, honestly, without pressure in either direction. "I want you to understand that I did not do this to trap her. I did it because it was, legally and ethically, the correct thing to do, and because some part of me, even after everything, still needed to know what kind of woman Rebecca truly was, underneath everything Adrian Cole had done to reshape her over the previous 3 years." According to Martin, who'd received the full account from Preston within the hour, Rebecca's attorney had needed to step out of whatever celebration lunch he'd apparently been attending to take the call, listened in stunned silence for nearly 4 full minutes, and then asked Preston to hold while he made a separate call directly to Rebecca. I do not know, and will never know with complete certainty, exactly what was said in the restaurant during those following minutes. But I know, from Noah, who still had that family group chat open on his phone in the passenger seat of my truck, that the celebratory photos stopped appearing almost immediately. I know, from a second-hand account Martin later heard through Preston, that Rebecca stepped away from the table, phone pressed to her ear, her face reportedly going pale as her attorney explained, carefully, exactly what she was choosing between: pursuing a formal legal claim to a multi-million-dollar trust that would likely take months of additional, expensive litigation and significant public financial disclosure to resolve, or signing a simple, immediate waiver, relinquishing any claim to it entirely. Rebecca chose to waive it. She signed the waiver that same afternoon, before she'd even finished her lunch, informing her attorney, according to what Martin later relayed to me, that she didn't want anything else from Daniel, and simply wanted the entire matter closed permanently. I have thought about that decision many times since. Part of me believes she genuinely, in that moment, wanted a clean, complete break from a marriage she'd already emotionally left behind. Another part of me, the more practical part, suspects Adrian had already convinced her, in the way he seemed to convince everyone of everything, that she wouldn't need my late business partner's money once his own current project difficulties finally resolved, as he had apparently been promising her for over a year by that point. Whatever her reasoning, Rebecca Foster formally, legally, and permanently waived any claim to the Callahan Family Legacy Trust on the exact same afternoon it became distributable to me in full. That was, remarkably, not even the most consequential thing that happened that particular day. While Rebecca was signing her waiver in a lawyer's back office somewhere across town, and while I was still standing in that gas station parking lot absorbing everything Martin had just told me, an entirely separate sequence of events was unfolding, one that Walter Grimes, still quietly monitoring certain financial threads at my ongoing request, called me about less than 2 hours later. Adrian Cole's largest remaining investor group, a consortium of 3 private lenders who had collectively put nearly $6 million into his flagship downtown development project 18 months earlier, had apparently been growing increasingly concerned about missed construction milestones and repeatedly delayed progress reports for several months. That same week, entirely independent of anything happening in my own divorce, those investors had finally commissioned their own independent audit of the project's finances. The audit, completed and delivered that very Thursday afternoon, revealed exactly what Walter had already quietly suspected months earlier. The project was functionally insolvent. Construction had effectively stalled nearly a year earlier, despite ongoing reports claiming otherwise, and roughly $1.8 million of investor capital could not be accounted for through any legitimate project expenditure. Walter walked me through the unraveling in careful detail over the following weeks, partly because he knew I needed to understand it fully to finally close this particular chapter, and partly, I think, because men like Walter simply enjoy watching a well-documented case prove itself out exactly as predicted. The Investor Consortium's independent auditor, a meticulous woman named Sandra Voss, whom Walter happened to know professionally from an earlier case years before, had discovered that Adrian's flagship downtown development, a proposed 12-story mixed-use building he'd been marketing to investors and the press alike as nearly 60% complete for almost a year, was in reality still sitting at foundation stage. Construction essentially frozen since a permit dispute 18 months earlier that Adrian had never disclosed to a single one of his investors. The progress photos he'd been circulating, it turned out, had been taken at an entirely different, unrelated project site 2 counties over, a detail Sandra's team uncovered simply by cross-referencing shadow angles and surrounding building permits against publicly available satellite imagery. Once that first thread was pulled, the rest of Adrian's carefully constructed world unwound with remarkable speed. Bank records subpoenaed during the civil complaint showed a consistent, years-long pattern of new investor capital being used not to fund actual construction, but to make interest payments on earlier, unrelated debts. The classic structure, Walter explained, of a man perpetually one step behind his own lies, borrowing from each new relationship simply to keep the previous ones from collapsing entirely. The $1.8 million in unaccounted investor capital that had triggered the initial audit turned out to be, upon fuller investigation, closer to $4.3 million, once every project and every associated shell company was properly traced. Within 72 hours, that investor consortium had filed a formal civil complaint against Adrian Cole personally, freezing every account connected to his name that their attorneys could identify, and referring the matter to the state's Securities and Financial Fraud Division for a criminal investigation into potential wire fraud and misappropriation of investor funds. Rebecca, according to what I later learned secondhand through mutual acquaintances who still occasionally spoke to her, found out about the fraud investigation less than a week after she'd celebrated her divorce with champagne, and less than 5 days after she'd voluntarily waived any legal claim to a multi-million-dollar trust I had, quite deliberately, kept entirely to myself throughout the entire proceeding. I did not call her to explain any of it. I did not reach out to gloat, or to explain the trust, or to tell her what Walter and I had known for months about the man she'd chosen to build her free new life around. I simply drove my sons home from that gas station, made them dinner, and sat with them on the couch that evening, watching a movie Ethan had been wanting to see for weeks, doing my absolute best to give them one quiet, normal, unremarkable evening on what had otherwise been an enormously consequential day for every adult in their lives. The weeks that followed brought Adrian Cole's entire carefully constructed world crashing down, with a speed that honestly even surprised Walter. And Walter had been tracking men like Adrian, in various forms, for most of his professional career. The criminal investigation expanded quickly once investigators started pulling threads, uncovering, over the following month, that Adrian had been running a nearly identical pattern of financial manipulation across at least 4 separate development projects over the previous 6 years, each one funded substantially by money, quietly diverted from women he'd carefully cultivated relationships with, each one collapsing eventually under the weight of debts he had never intended, or perhaps never truly been capable of, repaying. 6 weeks after my divorce was finalized, Adrian Cole disappeared entirely. His attorney reportedly informed the ongoing investigation that his client had left the country to attend to a family matter. Though no family matter of any kind was ever substantiated, and no formal extradition request has, to my knowledge, ever successfully located him in the years since. In the weeks after Adrian vanished, 2 of the other women Walter had identified months earlier, the dental practice owner and the widow, both came forward publicly once local news outlets picked up the story of his collapse, giving cautious, carefully worded interviews about their own experiences with him years earlier. Reading those interviews, I felt something I hadn't fully expected to feel. A kind of grim, sad solidarity with 2 women I had never met. both of whom described almost exactly the same pattern Walter had already laid out for me across his desk months earlier. The same promises of a shared future once current project difficulties resolved. The same slow, patient erosion of their trust over. The same slow, patient erosion of their trust over many months before any money ever changed hands. One of them, the widow, said something in her interview that stayed with me for a long time afterward. I don't think he ever saw us as people he was hurting. I think, in his own mind, he genuinely believed the next deal would fix everything, and that we'd all thank him eventually for believing in it alongside him. I don't know if that's true. I'm honestly not sure it matters whether it's true, given what he actually did to all of them regardless of what he privately believed about himself while he was doing it. He left behind, according to public court filings I eventually reviewed, out of what I'll admit was not entirely healthy curiosity, nearly $9 million in confirmed outstanding debts across his various collapsed projects, 4 half-finished construction sites, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather, and at least 3 other women, beyond Rebecca, who had quietly, privately, funneled significant portions of their own savings into his failing empire over the preceding years. Rebecca came to see me almost exactly 2 months after the divorce was finalized, unannounced, on a Saturday afternoon, while the boys were at their soccer practice. I remember opening the door and being genuinely surprised by how different she looked. Not physically, but in the way a person's entire posture can change once a heavy, carefully hidden weight has finally, publicly, been set down. She asked if she could come in, just for a few minutes, and I let her, because whatever else had happened between us, I still believed, and still believe, that 22 years and 2 children together earns a person at least the courtesy of being heard. I know about the trust, she said, sitting stiffly at our old kitchen table, the same table where our sons had once done their homework every single evening. Preston Marsh's office confirmed it when my attorney asked, after everything with Adrian came out. You knew. This whole time, during the divorce, you already knew you were about to inherit millions of dollars, and you let me sign that waiver without ever telling me the full truth of what I was actually giving up. I did, I said, because there was no honest way to deny it, and I had made a decision, months earlier in Preston Marsh's office, that whatever else happened, I would not lie to Rebecca about what I had and hadn't known, if she ever asked me directly. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't actually taken a sip from. I could have fought it, she finally said, legally. Preston told my attorney I had every right to formally pursue a claim before I waived it. Why didn't you tell me that, Daniel? Why did you let me sign it blind? Because you told your attorney you didn't want anything else from me, I said. And I believed you meant it. In that moment, whatever your reasons actually were underneath it. I wasn't going to talk you into fighting for money you told everyone you didn't want, Rebecca. That decision was always yours to make, with whatever information you chose to have in front of you when you made it. I did not tell her, that afternoon, everything Walter had uncovered about Adrian's pattern with other women, about the fabricated project renderings, about the careful, patient manipulation Walter's research suggested had been used on her specifically, over nearly 3 years. I decided, sitting across that kitchen table from a woman I had once genuinely loved for over 2 decades, that she had likely already begun piecing enough of that particular truth together on her own, through the investigation, through her own painful private reckoning with exactly how thoroughly she'd been deceived, and that it was not my place, or my responsibility, to hand her the rest of that specific pain on top of everything else she was already carrying. I'm sorry, she said instead, quietly, and I believed, watching her say it, that she genuinely meant it, not simply for the affair, not simply for the money, but for the slow erosion of 22 years that had led us both to that particular kitchen table on that particular Saturday afternoon. I know I can't undo any of it. I'm not asking you to forgive me or to pretend none of it happened. I just wanted you to know that I understand, now, exactly what I threw away, and exactly what kind of man actually threw it away with me on the other side of it. I told her honestly that we could not go back and rebuild what 22 years had once been, and that I did not think either of us should want to. But I also told her that Noah and Ethan needed both of their parents, steady and present, for the rest of their lives, regardless of everything that had happened between the 2 adults who'd brought them into the world, and that I was willing, fully willing, to build whatever kind of respectful, cooperative relationship would serve our sons best, going forward, one calm, deliberate step at a time. It has been 3 years now since that afternoon at the kitchen table. Rebecca has worked hard, genuinely hard, from everything I've observed, to rebuild an honest, present relationship with both boys, coaching Ethan's community soccer team for 2 seasons, driving 4 hours each way to attend every one of Noah's cross-country meets, his junior year of high school. We are not friends, exactly. Not in the way people sometimes imagine former spouses eventually becoming, but we are civil, cooperative, unfailingly respectful in front of our sons, and I have come to believe that this, quiet and unremarkable as it sounds, is its own kind of genuine victory. It has been 3 years now since that afternoon at the kitchen table. Rebecca has worked hard, genuinely hard, from everything I've observed, to rebuild an honest, present relationship with both boys, coaching Ethan's community soccer team for 2 seasons, driving 4 hours each way to attend every one of Noah's cross-country meets his junior year of high school. I remember the first time she showed up to one of those meets, standing awkwardly near the parents section, clearly unsure whether she was welcome to sit with the rest of the families, or whether that particular territory now belonged exclusively to me. I walked over, without either of us making it into a bigger moment than it needed to be, and told her there was plenty of room on the bleachers, and that Noah would want to see both of us cheering for him regardless of anything else going on between the two of us. She sat down, and Noah, crossing the finish line 20 minutes later, looked up into the stands, and saw both of his parents standing together, clapping, and I will admit that particular image is one I carry with me more than almost any other from that entire difficult year. We are not friends, exactly, not in the way people sometimes imagine former spouses eventually becoming, but we are civil, cooperative, unfailingly respectful in front of our sons, and I have come to believe that this, quiet and unremarkable as it sounds, is its own kind of genuine victory. As for the Callahan Family Legacy Trust, I made a decision early on, with Preston Marsh's careful guidance, about exactly how I wanted to use Robert's final gift to me. I did not simply absorb it into personal savings and disappear into early retirement, tempting as that thought was on my hardest days. Instead, I used just under half of it to expand Foster commercial refrigeration significantly, opening 2 additional regional service branches, one in a mid-sized city about 90 minutes north of our original territory, and another further south along a growing corridor of new restaurant and grocery development, hiring on nearly 40 new technicians and support staff over the following 18 months. And finally, after 26 years of 18-hour days, hiring a genuinely capable operations director named Renee Castillo, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd poached, with his blessing, from one of our largest commercial clients, so that I could, for the first time since I was 31 years old, actually step back from the day-to-day grind of running every single detail myself. Renee has, in the 2 years since, restructured our dispatch and scheduling systems in ways I honestly should have implemented a decade earlier. And the business is not just larger now than it was before the trust arrived. It is meaningfully, measurably healthier, running on systems instead of running entirely on my own exhausted shoulders, the way it had for over 2.5 decades. I used another significant portion of the trust to establish something I named, with Preston's help drafting the formal charter, the Robert Callahan Memorial Apprenticeship Program, a fully funded technical training pathway for young people, many of them from difficult family backgrounds not unlike my own at that age, to learn commercial refrigeration and HVAC trade skills without the burden of trade school debt hanging over them before they've even started their careers. I used another significant portion of the trust to establish something I named, with Preston's help drafting the formal charter, the Robert Callahan Memorial Apprenticeship Program, a fully funded technical training pathway for young people, many of them from difficult family backgrounds not unlike my own at that age, to learn commercial refrigeration and HVAC trade skills without the burden of trade school debt hanging over them before they've even started their careers. The program covers full tuition at our regional technical college's HVAC certification track, pairs every apprentice with a senior technician for a full year of paid, hands-on field training, and guarantees a full-time position at Foster Commercial Refrigeration for any apprentice who completes the program successfully, though several graduates have gone on to start their own small service companies instead, which honestly makes me prouder than if they'd simply stayed with mine. We've graduated 17 apprentices in the 2.5 years since the program launched, and I make a point of attending every single graduation ceremony personally, standing at the back of the room, watching young men and women receive certifications that Robert Callahan's quiet, patient generosity made possible 15 years after his own death. Robert believed in me before I had a single credential to justify that belief. I decided the least I could do, with what he ultimately left behind for me, was extend that same kind of belief to young people who needed exactly what I'd once needed myself. And the rest I have simply used to be present. I coach Ethan's baseball team now, something I never once had time for during Noah's childhood, and Noah, 16 going on 17 now, has started spending Saturday mornings with me at the shop, learning the business from the ground up, not because I'm pushing him toward it, but because he genuinely seems to want to understand exactly what his father actually does all day. The way I imagine I once wanted to understand my own father's long-haul trucking routes, before life and distance and a demanding job made that particular understanding harder to reach. Some evenings, when the shop is quiet and the boys are home doing homework at the same kitchen table where their mother once asked me to forgive her, I think about Robert Callahan, about a man who put his faith in a broke 28-year-old with nothing but a beat-up delivery van and a lot of stubborn determination, and who then, quietly, patiently, without ever telling a single soul, spent the final years of his own life making sure that faith would still be paying dividends 15 years after he was gone. I think about how close that trust came to becoming a factor in an ugly, drawn-out legal fight, and how grateful I remain, every single day, that Martin Hayes counseled me toward patience instead, toward silence instead of leverage, toward protecting my sons from an uglier version of a story that was already painful enough, without adding a courtroom battle over millions of dollars on top of it. I think, too, about Adrian Cole, wherever he actually is tonight, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer feel the sharp, burning anger toward him that I carried for most of that difficult year. I feel something closer to a distant, weary pity for a man who apparently spent his entire adult life building elaborate, temporary illusions of success, instead of simply doing the slow, honest, unglamorous work required to build something real, the way I did, one refrigeration compressor at a time, one long, unremarkable workday after another, for 26 straight years. I have replayed that entire year countless times since, usually late at night when the shop is closed and the house is quiet, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. There were a dozen moments, scattered throughout those 8 months, where a louder, angrier version of myself could have blown the whole thing up early, could have confronted Rebecca the night I opened that envelope, could have shown up at that restaurant the afternoon of the champagne photo, and made a scene both my sons would have remembered for the rest of their lives, for all the wrong reasons. I think about how easy it would have been to let anger drive every single decision, and how much worse, in almost every possible version of that story, things would have turned out for Noah and Ethan specifically, regardless of how satisfying it might have felt to me personally in the moment. I think too about how strange it is that the same patience I'd spent 26 years applying to broken compressors and stubborn refrigeration systems, the discipline of diagnosing a problem fully before ever reaching for a tool, turned out to be exactly the skill that carried me through the hardest year of my personal life as well. Robert Callahan used to tell me, back when we were young and broke and building something out of nothing together, that the men who last in any kind of business are never the ones reacting the fastest. They're the ones who understand the whole system before they ever touch a single wire. If there is one thing I have come to understand more clearly than anything else, sitting here now on the other side of the hardest year of my adult life, it is this. Patience is not the same thing as weakness. No matter how many people in your life try to convince you otherwise, while they celebrate too early, too loudly, over champagne glasses raised in a restaurant they don't yet know they cannot actually afford. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is say absolutely nothing, keep his head down, keep showing up for the people who actually depend on him, and simply let the truth finish arriving on its own patient, unhurried schedule. Some evenings now, sitting on the back porch after the boys have gone up to bed, I think about that whole difficult year as a kind of long, patient repair job, not unlike the hundreds of broken refrigeration systems I've diagnosed and fixed over 26 years. You don't fix a failing system by yanking out the first wire that looks suspicious. You trace the whole circuit first. You understand exactly where the failure started, and exactly what it's connected to, before you ever touch a tool. I think Robert understood that about me better than almost anyone else in my life, and I think, in his own quiet way, he built the Callahan Family Legacy Trust specifically to reward that particular instinct in me, whenever it eventually got tested hardest. My sons watched their mother celebrate the end of our marriage, with a room full of champagne glasses on a gray Thursday afternoon. They watched their father drive them home in near total silence, stop for gas, and take them out for burgers instead, because that was the kind of evening they actually needed, regardless of everything happening quietly in the background of grown-up phone calls neither of them fully understood yet. I have never once regretted choosing burgers over confrontation that particular afternoon, and I don't believe I ever will. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning in a courtroom. It is standing back up, patiently, deliberately, without ever letting someone else's betrayal be allowed to run the rest of your life for you. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to stay calm and steady for your kids while your entire world was quietly falling apart behind the scenes, hit that subscribe button and join the Humble Dad Stories family. Tell me in the comments below, have you ever had to wait, patiently, for the truth to come out on its own? I read every single comment, and I would genuinely love to hear your story. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.